The cold came in like a fist. Not the kind of cold that bites at exposed skin and retreats when you pull your collar up. This was the kind that found the gaps between boot sole and frozen ground, between the two flannel shirts Eli Marsh had stolen from a rancher's wash line 3 weeks back. It pressed through the wool and settled against his ribs and stayed there. He was 14 years old, and he had been living inside a haystack for 11 days. He had not planned it. You do not plan a haystack. You find one at dusk when your legs have stopped working properly, and the nearest town is 7 miles back along a road that a man on horseback told you 3 days ago to never walk again. So you pull at the hay with both hands until there is a hollow just wide enough for your shoulders, and you crawl inside, and you pull loose hay over the opening, and you wait to see if you are still breathing in the morning. He was still breathing. That was the surprise of it. The haystack belonged to an abandoned homestead, a half-collapsed sod structure 40 yards off, 2 fence posts still standing, a rusted singletree hanging from one of them like a broken jaw. Eli had checked the house the first day. The roof had caved on the south end. There was a cast-iron stove but no flue pipe, a tin cup with a crack along the rim, and a burlap sack that had once held cornmeal, the inside corners still faintly pale with dried dust. He took the cup and the sack. He left the stove because he could not move it, and a fire in a roofless structure would have been seen for 2 miles in any direction. He did not want to be seen. His father had made that clear. Not with words. Thomas Marsh had never needed many words. He had made it clear with the flat of a harness strap across Eli's shoulders on the morning of October 9th, and then with the gate latch dropping behind him, and then with the sound of boots going back toward the house while Eli stood in the road with one boot missing a lace and his coat pocket holding 4 biscuits wrapped in newspaper. That was it. 4 biscuits. 14 years of living, and 4 biscuits was what it came to. The biscuits were gone in 2 days. What he had now, 11 days in, was a system. It was not a good system, but it was a system, and in the Bitter Creek Basin in November of 1886, a bad system was the difference between living and not. He woke at first gray light, not because he wanted to, but because the temperature inside the haystack dropped sharply when the sun left the sky, and his body had learned, without being told, to rouse itself before the worst of it. He packed the loose hay tighter around his legs. He flexed his fingers inside the wool socks he wore on his hands until the numbness pulled back to a dull ache. Then he listened. He always listened first. A creek ran 40 yards east, Bitter Creek itself, narrow and iron-colored, slow enough at the bend to stay unfrozen at the edges. He had been filtering water through the burlap sack and letting it settle in the cracked tin cup before drinking. The way his mother had once shown him, you could pull mud out of a pond. Whether it worked well enough to matter, he did not know. His stomach had cramped twice, but he was still on his feet. Food was the problem that had no answer. He had gnawed pine bark twice when the hunger reached the point where his hands shook. It did nothing except give him something to do with his jaw. He had found a cache of dried rose hips along the creek bank, small and leathery, and he ate those slowly over 4 days, 6 at a time, so they would last. They tasted like dust and old leather, and he thought about them constantly when he was not eating them. On the morning of the 12th day, he heard the horse. Not the creak of wind through the fence posts, not the pop of frozen ground. A horse, the specific rhythm of iron shoes on hardpan, slow and deliberate, coming from the northwest along the creek line. He went absolutely still inside the haystack. The hay pressed against his face. He could feel his own pulse in his temples. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. 20 yards away. Maybe less. A man's voice, low, unhurried, speaking to the horse the way men do when they are looking at something that doesn't belong. Eli's hand found the only thing he had that could be called a weapon, a 6-inch piece of broken fencing wire, its end bent to a rough point. He gripped it. He did not move. Every muscle in his body made the same argument at the same time. Stay hidden, stay still, stay alive, while something else, something louder, said, he might have food. The horse did not move. Eli counted his own breaths, 4, 5, 6, and the animal stayed put, and the man stayed quiet, and that silence was worse than any sound. A passing rider keeps moving. A rider who stops is looking at something. Eli had dragged himself in and out of the haystack enough times to leave a trail in the frost, a shallow groove where his heels dragged, a dark patch where his body heat had melted the ground crystals overnight. To a man who read land for a living, it was a signed confession. The voice came again, not loud, not a shout. Boy. One word, flat as a stone dropped on ice. Eli's grip tightened on the wire. The bent point pressed into his palm hard enough to sting. He thought about his options the way a man thinks when he has no good ones, fast and with a sick feeling in the gut. He could stay silent and hope the rider moved on. He could bolt from the far side of the haystack and run for the creek, where the cut bank might give him cover. Or he could answer. He answered. I'm not armed. The lie came out before he decided to tell it. A pause, then boots on frozen ground. 2 steps. 3. The hay in front of Eli's face shifted as a gloved hand pulled it aside, and gray winter light came flooding in, and he saw the man for the first time. He was not tall, but he was wide through the chest the way men get who split wood every day of their lives. A battered plainsman's hat, black at the brim from old sweat. A sheepskin coat that had lost most of its wool on the left shoulder. His face was weathered to the color of saddle leather, and he had the eyes of a man who had stopped being surprised by things years ago. He looked at Eli the way you look at a lame horse, not without feeling, but calculating. He said, How long? Not a question. A request for data. 11 days, Eli said. Then, 12 now. The man looked at the cracked tin cup sitting near the entrance, at the burlap sack, at the rose hip stems Eli had stacked in a small pile because throwing them away felt wasteful. He looked at the wire in Eli's hand. His expression did not change. Put that down, he said. I've got biscuits. His name was Dunmore. He offered only the one name, and Eli did not push for another. He had a camp 3 miles northeast along the creek, a line shack he used when he was checking fence for the Crescent Bar outfit. He was not generous in the way that announces itself. He handed Eli 2 cold biscuits from a coat pocket without ceremony, the way you hand a wrench to a man under a wagon, and then he crouched and studied the haystack's construction with what appeared to be genuine professional interest. Pack the bottom tight, he said. Most wouldn't know to do that. Eli ate 1 biscuit in 4 bites and made himself stop. His stomach had shrunk, and he knew better than to rush it. He wrapped the second in the newspaper he still carried in his coat pocket, the same newspaper that had wrapped his father's 4 biscuits, now soft at the folds from handling. Dunmore built a fire against the lee side of the collapsed sod house, small and smokeless, feeding it with dry creek willow that burned hot and left almost nothing. He boiled water in a dented tin pot and produced a paper twist of coffee, black and bitter, and handed Eli a cup without asking if he wanted one. They sat on opposite sides of the fire. The horse, a short-backed grulla, stood hip-shot behind them, exhaling long white plumes. Where you headed? Dunmore said. South, Eli said. It was the only answer he had. South is a direction, not a destination. I know. Dunmore looked at him for a long moment. Crescent Bar's got a bunkhouse. Cook fires twice a day. Trail work until the ground freezes hard. He poured more coffee. After that, I don't know, but it's not a haystack. Eli should have said yes immediately. Any boy with sense would have. But there was a question he could not get past, the one that had been sitting behind his teeth since the moment he heard the horse. He did not know this man. He did not know the crescent bar. He had left one man's roof and one man's rules at the cost of a harness strap across his back, and the distance between a stranger's offer and his father's gate was not as wide as it looked on first measure. He stared at the fire. Outside the small warmth of it, the Bitter Creek Basin stretched flat and pale in every direction. Clouds were building to the northwest, not the thin passing kind. These were low and yellow-bellied, and they moved with the slow certainty of something that had already decided. Dunmore looked at the sky and said nothing. But he did not leave. Eli said yes before the clouds reached them. Not because the fear left. It did not leave. It sat in his chest the same way it had for 12 days. A tight, permanent pressure just below the sternum. The kind that makes every breath feel like a negotiation. He said yes because the sky to the northwest had turned the color of an old bruise, and because he had survived 11 nights in a haystack through system and stubbornness and a handful of dried rose hips, and he understood, with the clarity that only genuine cold produces, that what was coming would not be survived the same way. He kicked frost over the fire the way Dunmore showed him, not stamped out, spread thin, so nothing smoldered under the surface. He packed his 2 possessions, the cracked tin cup, the burlap sack. He put the folded newspaper back in his coat pocket. He left the wire. He did not know why leaving it felt significant. It just did. The ride to the Crescent Bar Line shack took the better part of 2 hours. Eli sat behind Dunmore on the grulla, his hands gripping the back of the sheepskin coat, the horse working steadily through grass that had gone stiff and silver with early frost. The wind came in from the northwest and found every gap in his 2 flannel shirts with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. He tucked his chin and watched the ground move under the horse's hooves and thought about nothing, because thinking about nothing was a skill he had developed, and it was the most useful one he had. The line shack was low and solid, built from notched pine logs with the gaps chinked in clay. A stovepipe came through the roof at a slight angle. There was a woodpile stacked chest-high along the east wall, covered with a tarp weighted at the corners with flat stones. Eli looked at that woodpile the way a starving man looks at a full plate, not with greed but with a gratitude so physical it felt like pain. Inside, a cast-iron stove that actually worked, a plank table, 2 rope bunks, a Dutch oven hanging from a nail, a half sack of dried beans, salt pork wrapped in cloth, a tin of lard. Dunmore built the fire with the efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Shaved kindling, dry pine, a single match. The stove began ticking as the metal expanded. Heat moved into the room like something alive. Eli sat on the edge of the lower bunk and felt his hands begin to burn as the warmth reached them. That burning was a good sign. He knew that now. The times it had not burned were the times to worry. Dunmore cooked beans with salt pork in the Dutch oven, slow, without speaking. He sliced cornbread from a wrapped block he pulled from a saddlebag, set 2 tin plates on the table, and sat down. Eli ate carefully the first few bites, then less carefully, then stopped caring about careful altogether. Dunmore ate without watching him, which was the most respectful thing a man could do. The blizzard hit 2 hours after dark. It did not build gradually. It arrived. One moment the wind was a pressure against the logs, and the next it was a roar, continuous and without pause, and the temperature outside dropped fast enough that the clay chinking popped and cracked as it contracted. Snow drove horizontal past the one small window, visible in the firelight as a solid white wall moving sideways. The stovepipe howled at a pitch just below human voice. Eli lay in the lower bunk with a wool blanket pulled to his chin and listened to it. He thought about the haystack, the specific weight of hay packed against his shoulders, the smell of it, dry and sweet and faintly of old summer, the way the hollow had held his body heat just enough. It had kept him alive. He was certain of that, and he was equally certain it would not have kept him alive through what was hitting the basin tonight. The walls of a haystack are 18 inches of packed grass and good intention. What was outside now did not negotiate. Dunmore was already asleep in the upper bunk, breathing with the slow regularity of a man who had made his peace with the country decades ago. The stove held, the logs held. Outside, the blizzard worked at everything it could find, tore at the tarp over the woodpile, hammered the stovepipe, buried the Grulla's tracks within minutes until there was no evidence that two people had ridden in from the southwest at all. By morning, the basin would be white and unmarked and silent. The haystack at the abandoned homestead would be a low mound under 3 feet of snow, indistinguishable from the frozen ground around it. The tin cup would still be inside it. The bent wire, too. Eli Marsh closed his eyes. He had nothing. He had survived. That was enough. For tonight, it was exactly enough. If Eli's story pulled you in, hit the like button. It tells us to keep making these. Subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales so you never miss the next fighter. Drop a comment below. When Dunmore crouched at that haystack and offered Eli a way out, Eli hesitated. Would you have trusted a stranger in the middle of nowhere, or held your ground alone? Because on this channel, the next survivor is already waiting.